Good afternoon, everybody. Can I get everybody to find a nice spot to sit down and listen more about games? Because I know you all are just dying to get past that old school 2D look and feel. Give everybody a minute to come on in. Yoo-hoo, everybody. All right, so today we've heard a lot about games, all the way from the old school of, hey, I need to blip my graphics on the screen one by one for every little pixel in the old construction kit, all the way up to, hey, I got this cool little 2D game of a grid and I want to put some gestures on it. Well, now we're going to take it to the next level, which is you've done the 2D stuff. Now you want to go to the 3D world and actually make things that are actually a little bit more realistic and actually have depth to them. And you can sort of achieve this depth with some of your 2.5D kind of stuff with Sprite Kit. It is capable of that. But we're going to go into 3D and actually how you can do it with real 3D and actually handle this. So Andy is going to come up here and talk us through some 3D code and show some samples.
All right, hi again, everybody. I am Andy Dombroski, and I will be taking y'all through kind of strategy and creative in 3D games, probably not going too deep, trying to keep it at a fairly high level, an overview of the different kinds of content you need, different things to address, things to keep in perspective. As some of you may know that have dabbled in 3D, it adds a lot of complexity and it can add a lot of developer cost as well. It also opens up a lot of avenues that you may not have thought about before. So starting off, getting into 3D. Bottle Rocket, when we started, we were focusing more on big brands and doing direct work for large companies, and I'll kind of go through like our corporate spiel because I think this resonates with a lot of us because we're all very passionate about what we do. But from day one, Bottle Rocket specialized in custom high-end mobile apps, and we strive to set industry standards. Strategic insight and design into gorgeous brand experiences, inspiring users and transforming businesses. I think that's, we all want to provide amazing user experiences and amazing value for our clients. And then when we make our own work, we obviously want to be able to make something that connects with users so that they can enjoy it, use it, hopefully pay us some money so we can make a living doing it. So Bottle Rocket had a remarkable team of strategists, engineers, and designers, great experience, and really passionate about pushing mobile. 3D was completely left out. Partially this was because when iOS first came out, it really didn't have 3D. And then one of the things that a lot of Bottle Rocket was passionate about was games, and I think a lot of you are too. So we said, what about making 3D games? Well, 3D apps are very different. Great art skills in 2D may not translate to being great at 3D. There's a lot of different considerations. Modeling 3D is very specialized, animating is very specialized, lighting is very specialized. So we realized that in order to make the kind of apps we wanted to grow into, we needed to get better at doing these things and foster these skills. That's why we made a group called Thruster to focus on gaming and gamification. That's where I came into Bottle Rocket. My history is in PC and console development, back starting on PlayStation. I got my start at a place called Origin Systems, and I learned from a lot of really great people, and I worked at Ion Storm and Monolith and Electronic Arts for a long time. And it's really funny because when I left console gaming, I was kind of done with it. I had just come off a team of almost 500 people and, you know, a $50 million game with Microsoft, and it's such an unbelievable beating when you're spread that thin and, you know, that far. And in development times of like 2.5 to 3 years, you know, it just wasn't fun anymore. So I came to Bottle Rocket to do games, and 3D was kind of the thing that I brought. So the first thing that we got into at Bottle Rocket was something that some of you have probably done, which is kind of quasi 3D. These may be games that actually have some 3D, as in there's actually depth, but it's still a simplified 2D look. For the programmers, you know, I mean, it's a polygon or a card that's just moving backward and forward, and it's always facing the camera. It's always billboarding. You know, apps or games sometimes have a 3D world with depth and width, but there's a simplified visual representation that you can use. So you may use, you know, for Annoying Orange, we used real images, photographic images, because that was the style that the Cartoon Network character was done in, and those have lighting and shading in them. When we did a game for Big Idea, which does the VeggieTales franchise, and luckily for that, they had 3D models because they make movies out of these things. So we really didn't need any particularly special staff for this. It was kind of something we grew into. But you know, the visuals are rendered and built into a perspective, so you can build in a degree of lighting. The sense of depth is sometimes increased by scaling the size of images. Some of these things are also done with what they were talking about with SpriteKit. Some of those things are very doable in SpriteKit. And then a big thing that characterized quasi 3D is usually the cameras are often orthographic, which flattens the entire world. For those of you who have messed with 3D, camera is actually incredibly important and can make or break your project. So the thing that I wanted to talk to everybody about was more, you know, true 3D. So a game that not only looks 3D, but also has, you know, you can traverse cameras around the world. You can go all over the place. So these are games that kind of originally came off of computers and consoles, but as the hardware has gotten better, we're actually capable of making some pretty impressive things on iOS. And especially once they opened up OpenGL ES 2.0 and started letting us use programmable shaders and some other things that make some really impressive looking effects, and I'll get into those earlier in a bit. So, I mean, true 3D games, you know, generally have perspective camera. Field of view is incredibly important. If you're setting up cameras in 3D, you need to take into account FOV, and based on how you set up your camera, things either look far away, close, you have to build things to scale. Again, considerations that you really don't have to worry about in 2D, because all you're focused on is usually, is it pixel perfect? Does it line up? All these things kind of change on 3D and become more complex. In fact, keeping most things pixel perfect in 3D is impossible with the exception of your UI elements. So there's a number of other methods that deal with, there's something called mip mapping, where as objects go farther in space, they drop texture resolution, so they look better. Another benefit of games with true 3D games is the ability to fully rotate around objects of the world as long as it's built to support viewing from all sides. So there's another thing where we're talking about building something in a more complex manner. So we have to actually take into account the cost of building a fully realized 3D world. Obviously, there's a lot of ways around that. You guys have all played games. Sometimes you can't go everywhere, and so they'll put up, you know, walls of trees, things like that. They don't have to model everything. Objects generally are going to be built out of complex arrangements of polygons. See a little pig down there? And they're going to take into account an overall poly budget. Another big thing about stepping into 3D is starting to be aware of poly budget vertex count. Again, things that I know most of you are probably familiar with just the regular windows that you use inside of iOS, but it changes once you're going into full 3D because the cost of those things can go up substantially. And if you think transparencies get bad in a regular app, like once you start going into 3D, transparencies get all over the place. So things to consider, some different elements of 3D. Characters are one of the focal points of many great games. They provide intimacy, they provide emotion, they provide attachment. These are some simplistic versions of characters, which this is kind of one option you could go with. You can go with kind of a lower poly, more retro feel. This was one where we purposefully accentuated the edges and the shading on characters. Retro is a good, popular option and frankly plays well to iOS. Now, most games spend a fair amount of their rendering budget on characters specifically. I'll show you another example, which is kind of the opposite blade. Infinity Blade is obviously a game that spends a huge amount of their budget solely on characters. There's just kind of a trade-off that you have to decide earlier. And again, largely because 3D development can be more time-consuming and expensive, you need to kind of put some stakes in the ground early on and know what you're trying to make. The other thing with characters is they can take a really long time to make, right? Because you'll go through concept phases and get concept artists, and then go from concept into your modeling phase, and then there will also be an animation phase. So 3D characters have a lot of, animating 2D characters is time consuming. It's much more consuming for 3D because, I mean, just imagine how you move, the full range of motion, being able to see things from all angles. It's stunning how some animations look perfectly fine from one angle, and then you look at them from another, from the side, and they look totally wrong. So there's just more work kind of goes into it. One thing we learned and that we do a lot, depending on the complexity of your game, try to be clever and use swappable parts of models. A guy with a sword and a shield and armor, you could make different parts of models that can come off and on. You can take the same giant guy and change out his texture and put different parts on him, and that helps him look different to the user. So you can get a greater amount of content out of your 3D. It's actually similar to one of the initial things that Bill said, where they skinned the pinball game, right? So you're essentially skinning the characters with different content to help make it, to deliver better value. Because a lot of time a character will come into a game, and so while you have your main characters that are constant all the time, you'll have little characters that come in and interact with them for a little while and then disappear. So one of the other things I wanted to mention going through some of this stuff, in case some of you are interested or are trying to push artists that you know into getting into some 3D, some common tools for 3D character modeling, Maya LT is what I would suggest looking at first, or Modo. Maya is extremely expensive, $4,000 or $5,000. Maya LT and Modo come in a little under $1,000. And then for people who are just trying to learn and are willing to slog through the kind of slings and arrows of not fully tested software, there's a thing called Blender that is a community 3D package. It's free, so you can't really complain that much about it. So one thing, we talked about things like Infinity Blade. We took a step into a game for WWE and went into high poly sculpting on iOS. So one of the great things about the last couple revisions, the last couple years, 3 years I would say, is the hardware is capable now of doing some fairly impressive character work. You kind of have to make sacrifices in other areas and use tricks in other areas, but you can do quite a bit. So your 3D apps can choose to use OpenGL shaders such as normal maps to create detail on a per pixel level. So normally we talk about polygons, and polygons create all the shapes, right? So polygons have textures on them, and textures are made up of pixels. Well, there's lighting algorithms that will work with OpenGL that will go through and actually change the intensity of the value of each pixel and add things like musculature and nipples, like whatever it is that you actually put on the surface. So one way to get past the limit of polygon budgets is you can kind of make a trade-off and say, well, we'll make per pixel shaders that will allow us to make a mesh that doesn't have a lot of detail and polygon detail, and give it a lot of detail in terms of muscles or veins, or you can use it for buckles. I mean, all kinds of things. Now, one thing about it is that it is a decidedly expensive option on most mobile devices. And it's kind of funny because you would think that like the latest greatest iPad would be really good at it. Well, it's better, but there's also a lot more pixels on the latest greatest iPad. And when you're calculating things on a per pixel basis, it's actually more expensive. So there's kind of a sweet spot performance-wise that you need to operate within. If you look into shaders, especially normal maps, there are fallbacks so that you can actually use, like on one device, on a new iPad, for example, a character may look like that on the surface, and on an older device, you would lose that lighting detail across the body of the character. So this is another specialized tool that we use. It's usually ZBrush and Mudbox. They're kind of the main names in the game. There's a couple other peripheral tools that you might be able to use for normal maps, but for sculpting, those are kind of the main ones that you would use. And then sculpting, I mean, just so you guys know, it's literally you build a thing out of, like this is from ZBrush, and you build this thing out of what's called Z-spheres, and you're literally sculpting, like with a tablet and a pen. And so you go through and you trace, you carve little holes and things like that, when you're creating your character. So high poly sculpts are common, and that's a real way to push your stuff into 3D. If you have a lot of budget, like some very large companies might, they'll actually do this on environments too. So they'll actually build brick walls and things in the same manner, and then render all that detail out and put it on a flat polygon, and it looks like it's a ton of detail. It's probably cost prohibitive or time prohibitive for indies most of the time. But again, if you're good and you're passionate, I think it's one of those things where you're just making a value judgment of like what's going to make your game stand out. So kind of the next thing with 3D games to take into account is animations are very different in 3D as opposed to 2D. Kind of talked about that, different angles, it looks different. 3D character animation is usually done through bones, and the bones are animated and have a collection of polygons or vertices tied to them that are weighted. So what that means is you have a shape like a cylinder, and the points on that make up that cylinder are moved when the bone moves. So that cylinder can change, or you can take it away or add new things, and depending on the weights of what composes the shape, it moves with the deforming bone. So because animations are very time intensive to make, and based on complexity of model, they can obviously take much, much longer. Imagine, you look at Star Wars movies or things like that, like exotic sword fighting, those kind of things take a long time. Making a blob bounce and stuff, very easy, very fast. So, one of the things that we do with our 3D is we'll go through and we'll make, sketches of weight and action, kind of the feeling of what characters are actually doing, how they're doing it. Again, it's one of those things where you're trying to make sure that you know what you're going to get what you want before you start, making the time investment into actually animating. That purple thing up there on that guy, those are the bones, and so he's got leg bones, he's got hands. I mean, again, a lot of you probably know this or know of it, but on mobile, bones are more expensive because, well, actually, I guess technically programmers are probably not more expensive. They're just the processor may not be quite capable of handling as many. So one of the things we ran into frequently was the number of vertices that the bones can influence is lower because it starts hogging system performance, and our skeletons start taking up, loads and loads of cycles. So, another thing I would caution, and again, this is more so on high-end characters, humanoid characters, animals, things like that, non-bipeds. A tricky part of the pipeline is you really want to be done with any models before you animate them. Because if you go back and change the models, then you have to reweight them and potentially change the animations depending on what parts you added. For example, if that guy had a tail, well, what is the tail tied to? What's going to animate that? Well, it probably needs another set of bones. So it's another area where a little planning can go a long way to saving you tons and tons of grief. Another thing you can do, and this is, again, because my goal is not to scare people away from 3D. I love 3D. I live 3D. So, I'm just trying to give you all actual kind of actionable tools, things you can use going forward and trying to use in your apps. A single skeleton for multiple characters is a good option to reduce the amount of work. So, most people, actually most men and women, could use the same size skeleton. You just may have two different sets of animations because they may walk differently. Likewise, you could have, you have all kinds of different manners in which people move, and so you can actually use the same skeleton on all of those and kind of reduce your cost. You can also use that in a way to make things more unique, where you have a marquee character and you give them a certain type of gait or a certain set of gestures that's kind of how they move through the world and how they interact with the world. So with animations, some of the tools that we actually mentioned come up again. So Maya, MyLT, and Modo, they're all, now actually just as another side note, I didn't include Windows tools. We only work on Macs, so that's all I included. Technically, if you wanted to use 3D Studio Max or something, that would work. Again, for animation, Blender can be used. It's free. It's easy to get into, especially if you're going the route of trying to go something like Cocos 3D and keep all your costs down and just experiment with it. Blender might be a good option. So kind of those last ones were more about characters. So I'll kind of go in a little bit about environments. So 3D environments are another one of these things where we want to put a lot of time and planning into making sure we're doing it right. There's a huge amount of variety in terms of the requirements related to 3D environments. Just like when we talked about SpriteKit, there's all these things to think about with how the bumpers and pool work and how it needs to react when it hits this surface. Is the surface slick, or the physics properties, all that stuff. Again, these things get magnified in 3D because in 3D, when you start building that environment, you need to take that table and you need to decide, well, okay, what kind of game am I making? Is it a game that has cover? Can I flip the table? Can I climb over the table? Can I break the table? Can I eat the table? What can I do with these things, right? So making sure that there's a big strategy weight that you really want to know the core of what your game is and that it's fun before you start investing all this time in assets that are going to look like this. This isn't iOS specific, this is just good game philosophy in general. We would build whole segments of games completely out of blocks and cylinders and things like that because we would want to make sure that things were fun. If any of you played any of the like Call of Duty type games or things like that, those games, those worlds, they're built completely rough because they need to get cover height down. How high can somebody pop up and go under? What can I mantle over? What can I kick? What does it do? So again, the variety of requirements, there's not really an easy way to say, hey, do X, Y, and Z and your environments are good, because it really depends on what your game is and what you're trying to put in it. Racing games, for example, take tons of art content to be able to make them look really high-end. But on the other hand, you can sometimes procedurally generate portions of it because people aren't going to be looking at it for as long. A lot of games reuse assets or pieces of art, like a lamppost, a trash can, things like that get reused very heavily. That actually becomes another thing to consider on mobile too, because you may start running into, believe it or not, memory concerns. And suddenly you don't want to be loading tons and tons of unique art assets. Another thing is some game types may want huge vistas. So this is a pretty big challenge on iOS because a lot of time depending on how we build them, in consoles we would build them for real, and sometimes you could even go there. So on iOS you have to do a lot of you kind of have to fake distance a lot and try to create a sense of a bigger world. Again, depends on your game. Some games won't have those types of elements to them. But if you are doing vistas in 3D worlds, you have to consider that, because remember, you're with a camera that can move, a camera can come down, and are you going to allow it to come down to the horizon, right? Because as soon as you show a horizon line, there's an expectation of what mountains do, and I'm in Dallas right now, so there's no mountains, but like here, there's like, whoa, hey, look, there's mountains over there, so you got to consider that. The same thing goes for any other elements that you might want in your distance. How are you going to keep them there? How are you going to draw them? All those things. So vistas, you can do them, but you have to do a lot of planning. Another thing I would actually say with vistas is, remember, you have control over your camera. So again, when we talk about defining your game rules determine a lot of what your creative is going to do. I mean, it's a lot like any consumer app you would do too, right? Like the requirements of the app. And I'm sure everybody, there's always that creative tug between your artists and your devs. And I think that's a good thing, but your devs will think of things that, well, this is the spec and this is what it should do. And the artist is like, oh, well, we really want this button to do this and animate and do these things. And so it's good to have that creative conflict. But I think with 3D, again, it's one of those ones where you have to be assertive and determine, what are you really going to do with your visual space, because in my experience, when 3D games go bad from a performance perspective, often they go very bad. So you don't want that to happen. So another thing with environments, scale is very important. Once you break the rules of your scale, all kinds of issues can arise. There's lots of popular games that you could go back and look at, going back to like Doom and Quake and stuff like that. And if you ever stop someone and make them stand in a doorway, you'll notice that doors aren't normally 12 feet tall and 6 feet wide and things like that. Now, players usually don't notice those kind of things, so there isn't a simple one-size-fits-all solution to this. I remember when we were making a Ghostbusters game, and we built all the firehouse out where all the Ghostbusters are, like the upstairs area and the tables. And then we noticed, like, oh, hey, the tables are at chest level. That's great. So you want to plan for these things. Some of them players will notice, but again, it's also about, remember, there's a user experience that you're taking into account. So you may need extra wide doors. I can also tell you that, I don't know if anybody has a passion with this, but like most games do not have fire code involved in any way whatsoever. Yeah, like the way doors open up, they ignore it. Another thing you'll notice missing is bathrooms. I was very proud of myself when I worked on a game called Deus Ex, and my levels had bathrooms. And I was very proud of that because, again, this is something that just normally gets missed. But it's just something you have to take into account when you're building your environments, making sure that you're dealing with scale relative to gameplay, and then just keep it consistent. And as long as you establish rules in your universe, then players will usually accept that. It's just like physics, just like almost anything else. one of the ways to make players feel great is give them a set of rules they can learn and then let them apply those rules and solve problems. And that makes them feel intelligent and empowered, and that's what makes a great experience. So the other thing I wanted to mention, and this is mostly an art thing, but I think especially for anybody who's indie and trying to do this stuff, these are things to think about. Composition is extremely important. Composition tells a story, especially in 3D, because in 3D, there can be stuff behind it. We used to call, at Monolith, we called spaces that you couldn't see behind them points of possibility. We largely made kind of scary games, if you played any of the fear games or things like that. But take a hallway, and you've got just a plain old hallway, and you can see down it. Well, you add a window, and well, that becomes a point of possibility. Something could happen there. You add a vending machine, and now you can't see past that vending machine. Something could happen there, right? So you're creating a mood, and you're creating options for the player. You're telling a story. Most everybody probably went to high school. You got a gym, right? And it's late at night. The school's closed. Open the gym doors. You would expect there to be nothing there. It's empty, right? Put a chair in the middle and like a paper bag next to it. Like, that's weird. Like, what's going on there? So, your environments tell a story. And so use that to your advantage. Environments, so common tools, again, this is some of the same tools we've actually used, which is great. It just means that once you make the investment on these, you really want to do something with them. Same thing, Maya, MyLT, Modo, and then again, Blender is also an option. Okay, so one of the other things that is usually separated out by 3D is lighting and VFX. Now normally, actually, VFX is usually going to be separate anyway, even a 2D game. But lighting, in 2D games, we have a tendency to build lighting into the actual art as we're making it. In 3D games, we don't actually tend to do that just because of the way the modeling process works. Now, you can bake things in, but as soon as you bake lighting into a 3D model, it looks right from one side and from one position. So there's other considerations to take into account. So your scenes are going to be filled with a variety of different light types. You may need somebody who gets into lighting. And again, that's not a thing that you might be used to. There's a variety of different types of lights: skylights, omnilights, spotlights. If you're going more the high-end route, there's what's called global illumination, and even some methods that you can use on iOS for ambient occlusion, which you're going to bake in. You can't do that real time. But that's basically the pooling of shadows and the way that, as long as you keep those things static, all the crevices actually build up shadows, and it tends to look much, much more real. Another thing would be with lighting would be what's called radiosity, and the ability to bounce color as well, because real light actually bounces color off things. So from personal experience, finding people with experience in lighting can help a lot. You can also use lighting to take the same scene, use it twice, the same 3D assets, and then use them again. It's night, it's day, It's a good way to kind of get more bang for your budget with your environment art. I think movies and real life are actually really good reference. But if you know anybody who does stage lighting or anything like that, or went to school for theater, odds are they don't do that now, but there's a very good chance that they'll give you advice on it. Our project manager is a former stage lighter. He gives us great advice on how to light things. So then I think the other thing with lighting, it's kind of the same as the last point with your environments. Your lighting and VFX should really tell a lot about how the player should feel, and people will react to that, right? You do it in a movie, it's rainy, it's stormy, these are just things that you want to consider when you're building your app, when you're building your space in 3D. Some tools for these, again, some of the same tools that we've seen before. Another thing you might want to look into is Beast Global Illumination. They have a really cool system that plugs into Unity, and then they also have some SDKs and things you can use to put into your own 3D code. So the big, kind of the big tough point I think for a lot of people, although this is probably more for artists and less for programmers, using shaders. Shaders are a very powerful option that can really separate your app, but they're very specialized. Shaders are normally done for iOS in a language called CGSL. I don't know how many people actually know it, but it's like any programming language. Like there's rules, there's fairly simple things that you can learn and use it. iOS does support OpenGL shaders, and specifically there's a group called, there's a subset called OpenGL ES that supports, and I believe we're up to 3.0 on that now. Now, ironically, for some of you who are old and who may have done old PC games, you might want to look into this stuff because the iOS shader language and where it is as a platform, it's roughly where PCs were like 10 years ago. So I was shocked when I came over because I hadn't done this stuff for years, and I came over to iOS and all of a sudden it was like, oh, that thing that you did, you know, when 7, 8 years ago, it's relevant now and you can use it now, and so that's great. So sometimes you can find, you know, people who have experience with the way they used to be, and it's still valid on iOS. And really the other thing is don't get scared of shaders because there's so many cool things you can do with shaders. And I couldn't make slides that can really justify it because you can like take things and blast them apart with shaders, and I mean it's its own programming language. You can do tons of things with it. They're really cool. And I just kind of threw up some examples of just simple shaders that can change the way things look or mimic. I mean, you know, all of this stuff is actually on iOS. You know, I think one thing we'll start to see, well, in fact, I can guarantee you'll see it because it'll start coming out in a couple months. You'll start to see some enterprise apps using high-end shaders. And then, you know, characters, all that stuff, same deal. Okay, so, yeah, that's my last one. So, learnings and advice. 3D may seem like a scary jump. It really doesn't have to be. 3D is expensive to develop, so pre-planning and prototyping is very important. Artists can be technical, programmers can be artistic. I think everybody can design. That's just, I think you embrace that, and that's one of the ways you can succeed with 3D on mobile. Continually integrating and playtesting, I think that came up earlier. You know, make sure your game is fun. Keep playing it. And by continually playing it and testing it, you will see whether or not your performance is up to snuff, all of those things. And then, sure, you know, make sure your market understands 3D. 3D can be intimidating. Make sure that you think your market will be comfortable with it when you're going to a 3D app. That being said, with Minecraft, like in 5 years, everybody will get 3D, so maybe it's a moot point. And then, you know, the other thing I would say is when you're learning and getting into 3D on iOS, I would consider using some kind of IDs or established engines. Unity, Cocos 3D. So just some things that take care of some of the work for you, so that before you jump in and build your own engine, you kind of have a stepping point or a stepping stone to get off from. So I think that's it. And I don't know if we have time.
We have a little bit of time for questions.
If anybody has any questions, I can.
Raise your hand.
I know, that was all daunting. It's like so complex. It's going to cost you millions of dollars to do. So hire Bottle Rocket instead, right?
No.
So, what kind of custom toolkits do you develop if you're using for Blender? Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
So, do you develop your own toolkits? Do you use them for multiple projects?
So we have a plugin suite that we have made for Maya specifically that kind of automates some of our processes. I don't know that there's any good off-the-shelf solutions that will provide everything to everybody, but there's a lot of depending on what you're making, there's a lot of what's called decimation tools that reduce poly count and things like that that you'll want to look into. But it's really going to be different for every project.